Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 830 for August 2nd, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
What always blows my mind, when I was standing in Rickhouse A last year, I got to thinking about how many decades of master distillers walked floors and how many decades of barrels, where the Angel's share just went into the bracing and the wood there, that you're just basically smelling history. And so every distiller and every barrel has left its mark on that rickhouse. And so it is true Kentucky history, Rickhouse A, living history in many ways, because rickhouses are kind of like living things. I mean, they breathe and they age. It's really a unique thing.
David Jennings turned his passion for wild turkey into a project, writing the definitive history of the whiskey and the families that made it. His book, American Spirit, Wild Turkey Bourbon From Ripy to Russell, was published earlier this summer, and a second printing is in the works to meet the demand. I'll talk with David Jennings later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and
Japanese Mizunara oak my grandfather had long wanted to do. While he was at Brown-Forman, he had a wonderful partnership with Suntory and their whiskeys. And then, as you probably remember, when he left Brown-Forman, he did some consulting work for Suntory. So huge appreciation for Japanese whiskeys, the flavor of those whiskeys, how they were made, the wood maturation techniques, things like that. So he had always really wanted us to do something like that as well.
The news is next on this edition of WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. There's unity on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean over the import tariffs on whiskies, along with other spirits, beer, and wine. The trouble is, the unity is among industry groups, and not the politicians who have the power to end the tariffs. 17 groups representing the entire U.S. and European drinks industry called on the Trump administration to remove the current tariffs on single malt whiskeys from Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with liqueurs, other spirits, and wines from around Europe. The 25% tariff in place since last October has cut Scotch whiskey exports to the U.S. by more than $275 million, with even larger impacts for liqueur and wine producers. Next week, we'll find out whether U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer will recommend increases in those tariffs to as high as 100% and expand the list of affected products to include all European whiskies. That announcement is expected on August 12th. The industry groups also called on European Union leaders to remove their 2-year-old 25% tariff on American whiskies, and for both sides to de-escalate the ongoing trade war. They're citing last week's move by Airbus to restructure its government subsidies to comply with World Trade Organization rules as a reason to end the conflict, along with moves earlier this year by the state of Washington to bring its subsidies for Boeing into compliance. We'll keep following this story as it develops. Check whiskycast.com and our social media timelines for the latest details. Meanwhile, the conflict over the role bars may or may not be playing in the spread of the COVID-19 virus is showing no signs of ending anytime soon. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine ordered a curfew on liquor sales statewide, with no sales allowed after 10 p.m. each night. The order went into effect Friday night, and an Ohio TV station reports at least 4 Cleveland area bars were cited by state liquor agents that very night for violating the mandate. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper is expanding that state's bar closing order to also ban restaurants from selling alcohol after 11 p.m. That new mandate took effect this weekend. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has banned indoor service at bars and restaurants statewide as of this weekend, though bars can still serve drinks outdoors, along with to-go and delivery sales. There is one positive note for the state's distilleries. Most of them will not be covered by the order, which also applies to breweries and vineyards. The order applies to licensees that get more than 70% of their revenue from selling drinks on site. And in Kentucky, Governor Andy Beshear has ordered bars closed until at least August 11th, while cutting indoor seating at restaurants to 25% of capacity. Restaurants with liquor licenses can only sell alcohol with food purchases. In New Orleans, Mayor LaToya Cantrell has now ordered the city's bars closed completely and banned restaurants from selling takeout cocktails and other drinks. And Texas regulators have suspended the liquor licenses for at least 18 bars around the state that ignored Governor Greg Abbott's order to close bars as part of a so-called Freedom Fest protest by bar owners. And a Colorado judge has rejected a request by the Colorado Tavern League to block Governor Jared Polis's executive order that imposed capacity limits and a 10 p.m. curfew on alcohol sales at bars, while allowing retail stores and delivery sales to continue after 10 p.m. Now let's talk about new whiskeys unveiled this week. We'll start off with Angel's Envy, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary with what is being billed as the first bourbon ever to be finished in Japanese Mizunara oak casks. It's a project that got its start shortly after Lincoln Henderson and his son Wes founded the brand. They filled their very first port wine casks with bourbon on August 19, 2010. Lincoln Henderson had wanted to do something with Japanese oak in those early years after consulting for Suntory following his retirement from Brown-Forman. And after Lincoln died in 2013, Wes's son Kyle took up the goal of fulfilling his grandfather's goal. Their partners at Kelvin Cooperage in Louisville were finally able to source enough new Mizunara oak to make 5 barrels, while Kyle and his team created a blend of 4- and 9-year-old bourbon.
We were looking for something that would take this influence of Mizunara and kind of elevate itself to finish it off. So we put those whiskeys together, put them in this cool Mizunara oak barrel. We got 5 of them for this finishing project, and oh my goodness, Mizunara is extremely hard to get a hold of, as it took us about 5 years to get, and then quite expensive, in order of magnitude, almost 15 times what an American oak barrel costs us now. And we got the barrel, put it in there, and we knew, from my grandfather's experience working with Suntory and the Japanese whiskeys, that it was going to take time to do this finish. We'd already aged the whiskey. It was already, a bourbon that we theoretically could have used for our flagship port finish whiskey. But we knew going in, it wasn't going to be the 3 to 6 months that the port finish typically takes for us. So I more or less planned on a year, maybe a year and a half, and we were sampling every 3 months or so. And about a year in, kind of nothing. It hadn't really changed much, hadn't really developed or anything, which was kind of surprising for us. So we kept on going. And it really wasn't until about 18 months in that you started to begin to get this, the Mizunara kind of distinctiveness. And for me, what's distinctive about, especially new Mizunara, was kind of this incensey, smoky sandalwood. We really started to pick that up. And then over the next few months until we got to about the 2-year mark, you began to really develop that smokiness, the incense, the woodiness.
There will only be 1,200 bottles of the Japanese Mizunara oak cask finish available. Members of the Angel's Envy 500 Main Club can buy a bottle starting on the 19th at the distillery in Louisville, while the rest will go on sale to the public September 1st at the distillery and select Kentucky retailers. The price tag, around $350 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Now, while that's only a 10th anniversary celebration, Johnny Walker is celebrating the 200th anniversary of John Walker opening his original grocery store in Scotland. The brand unveiled 4 new whiskeys this week. The Johnny Walker Blue Label 200th Anniversary Edition will be the only one of the 4 not coming to the U.S. The U.S. gets the Blue Label Legendary 8. It's a blend of whiskeys from 8 distilleries that were all making whiskey back in 1820. It'll sell for $350 a bottle in the U.S. There's also the John Walker & Sons Celebratory Blend. It marks the launch of the family's Old Highland whiskey in the 1860s and will carry a price tag of around $75 a bottle. Finally, the John Walker & Sons Bicentenary Blend uses whiskey from Port Ellen, Pittyvake, Cambus, and other long-closed distilleries that are all at least 28 years old. It'll have a recommended retail price of $1,000 a bottle. All 4 are expected to hit retailers this autumn. Meanwhile, Heaven Hill is expanding the Elijah Craig lineup with a new toasted barrel bourbon. It's the same whiskey that goes into Elijah Craig's small batch, but spends extra time in specially made barrels that are first custom toasted by Independent Stave Company, followed by a level 1 flash char to sear the wood. It'll hit selected retailers on a limited basis starting next month for around $50 a bottle. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. Also on the bourbon of sorts front, Woodinville Whiskey is out with a bourbon mash triple barrel blended whiskey. The Washington State Distillery took its mature bourbon and filled it first into used bourbon barrels, followed by barrels previously used for peated Islay single malt from Scotland. They don't specify the distillery, but when you remember that Woodinville is part of the Glenmorangie Company family, along with Ardbeg, well, it's not hard to connect the dots. The use of those used bourbon barrels means it can't be called a bourbon. It is available only in Washington State through the distillery's website for about $70 a bottle. I received a sample of it this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. It'll be a while before we get to taste the whiskey from Ireland's newest distillery. Work is complete now on the Tipperary Boutique Distillery, and as co-founder Jennifer Nickerson told us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast this week, there is just one final step left.
My poor husband is out in the dark and the rain unloading barley right now. So while I'm sitting here chatting to you, he is outside using a forklift to move around half-ton bags of malt. We just need some more permissions from revenue to agree that we're allowed to do it. And then we can start commissioning. So we are so close. Oh, and we need Stuart as well. I forgot that part. We need Stuart to come over and tell us how to commission it.
Of course, Stuart is Jennifer's father, veteran Scotch whiskey distiller Stuart Nickerson. He's in Scotland waiting for travel restrictions to be relaxed, enough that he can travel over to Ireland without having to spend 14 days in quarantine. And finally, another red tape story out of Ireland. I mentioned Chapelgate Whiskey Company's new J.J. Corey The Lock-In Edition last time around. Louise McGuane and her team finished bottling the whiskey after having the label reviewed and approved by Ireland's Health Service executive. It included this line on the back label: "We are as transparent as the strange laws governing Irish whiskey allow." However, after Ireland's national broadcaster RTE did a story on the lock-in blend, including that label, someone in the government decided to take another look, and you can probably guess what's coming. Chapelgate was then told that the use of the word strange was an opinion that could mislead consumers, and was threatened with legal action if the label wasn't changed. Louise tweeted the whole story out, noting that reprinting the labels is costly, and they had a shipping deadline to meet. So her team took every bottle out of the cases and marked out the word strange by hand with a black marker on every single bottle, while posting video of the alterations on Twitter to explain it. They met the deadline to get the bottles to irishmalts.com in time for sales to start this week. Now, it seems that someone in the Irish Health Service executive could have realized that no one would probably have ever noticed the original label, But now, everyone who sees that bottle will realize that the labels were censored. Bureaucrats. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. We have a bit of our own news this week as well. We'd like to welcome our newest presenting brand partner. Dewar's has come on board as one of the 2 presenting sponsors of WhiskyCast, along with Redbreast. You'll be hearing more from them in the coming weeks here on the show, but for now, please join me in thanking Dewar's and all of our sponsors for their support. Hope you had the chance to catch our live webcasts this past week. In addition to the father and daughter team of Jennifer and Stuart Nickerson on Whiskey Wednesday the other night, I was joined by bourbon writer Gabrielle Farms and Scott Brunel from the Scotch Test Dummies on our Friday night happy hour webcast. This week, forester and author Tom Kimmerer will be my guest on Whiskey Wednesday. He's a former faculty member at the University of Kentucky and has worked as a consultant for bourbon companies, and pretty much can answer almost any question you might have about the way oak interacts with whiskey during maturation. That's coming up on Wednesday at 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time, and 2100 GMT elsewhere in the world. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Event changes announced this week. The Midlands Whiskey Festival in Birmingham, England, originally set for September 11th, has now been postponed until next year. Ticket holders are being emailed details on options for refunds or using their tickets next year. There's also an update on the Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival at the end of September and the first weekend of October. The organizers posted an update on the festival's website this week that they are still waiting for Swedish government guidance on the number of people that will be allowed to attend. And they do have several backup plans in place. They plan to update the festival's website as soon as more information is available. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky is open with 25% seating capacity under the health restrictions we mentioned earlier. It'll be kicking off a series of Wayback Wednesday bourbon tastings this Wednesday night, led by owner Jason Bronner, featuring vintage bourbons. While Australia's state of Victoria is now in a state of emergency because of a flare-up of COVID-19 cases, Tasmania's current restrictions are currently allowing Tasmanian Whiskey Week events to go ahead as planned in Hobart, Launceston, and Burnie from August 10th through the 16th. Tickets are still available for the Redbreast Dream Cask Annual Dinner, August 10th at the Bodega Restaurant and Whiskey Bar in Waterford, Ireland, as well as Whiskey and Barrel Night that's currently scheduled to be held in New York City, August 20th. Bonhams will have its next auction of rare whiskeys and wines August 21st in Hong Kong, with provisions in place for online, absentee, and telephone bidding in place, should health restrictions prevent in-person bidding. And the Bavarian Inn in Frankenmuth, Michigan, will host a Maker's Mark bourbon dinner on the 21st as well. As we've been saying for months now, all in-person events on the calendar are subject to change on short notice depending on public health restrictions, so please double-check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. We're keeping the calendar of events at whiskycast.com updated as we get details from event organizers and have already started adding 2021 events to the calendar. It's brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states and 3 continents, and online too. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please, drink responsibly.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. One of our recurring themes over the years has been the unique passion whiskey inspires in people, like our interview last week with Sean Josephs of Pinhook Bourbon. I've talked with people who have given up successful careers in other professions because they caught the whiskey bug and decided to open their own distilleries, or become brand ambassadors, or find another place in the whiskey fabric. David Jennings is another one of those people. If you're active on Twitter, you might know him better as @RareBird101. He's a Wild Turkey superfan and decided to channel that passion and energy into writing what I'd call the definitive history of his favorite whiskey. David's book, American Spirit, Wild Turkey Bourbon From Ripy to Russell, has just been published, and it apparently struck a nerve. His publisher has already sold out of the entire first printing, and they're working on printing more copies to meet the demand. I asked David how he found that passion when we talked this weekend.
Well, it's funny how things happen. It's not like something that just you wake up overnight and it happens. This happens over a period of time. And, I didn't get into whiskey seriously till around 2013, 2014. And I say serious as in wanting to appreciate whiskey more than just, a mixer or something of that nature. And, as I got into my whiskey journey and tried different things, I discovered that Wild Turkey was not what I recall it from college, where it was like the shooter of the party booze. That it was a quality product. And I was introduced to some vintage Wild Turkey expressions. And those really just kind of sparked a fire in me to go find, the best that Wild Turkey had to offer. And so I started buying up every expression I could find on the shelf, never really finding, that vintage vibe, but discovering new profiles along the way. And of course, I was drawn to the story of the Russells. I feel like Wild Turkey has a story that's about as genuine as it gets in the whiskey world. And, there was an attractiveness there. I could relate to it as a person, not just a brand. And, I like the underdog vibe of Wild Turkey. It was neat to find something that I assumed would be one way and turns out it's another. And, a lot of people say, well, why Wild Turkey? And to those same people, why the Atlanta Braves or, whatever. It's like, everybody kind of, you have some kind of connection, and sometimes that's easy to explain and sometimes it's not. So I've tried to do the best I can in explaining that, but, there is something about it that, really pulls me in, and I'm a true blue, diehard Wild Turkey fan. They've got me for life.
Did you have cooperation from Campari America, the current owners, and the distillery to write the book?
Yeah, I guess I skipped over a good bit of my story there. I mean, I started a blog in 2016. It was really kind of just a dumping ground for my Reddit reviews for Wild Turkey since I was doing so many of them. And I went public with it in 2017, and I attracted a little bit of attention from different writers and bloggers. And then, I was introduced to Campari, sometime mid-2017. So they were aware of what I was doing. And, I got to meet Jimmy and Eddie. And, of course, gotten to know Eddie very well over the past couple of years. And I've met Bruce and Joanne. And I've had nothing but a good relationship there, both with the Russells and Campari. Nothing but cooperation. And when it came to the book, my wife had the suggestion that I write a book. She's like, well, you're writing all these blog posts all the time. Why don't you just, write a book? And it seemed like such a huge task. I'd never written a book before, but I did it. I listened to her advice and I gave it a go. And, a couple of years later, here it is. But, I had a lot of help, relatives of the Russells and the Russells themselves. I've had a lot of help from members of the Ripy family, like Tom Ripy. Campari's been very helpful to me. So there were a lot of people, including a lot of Kickstarter supporters, that backed the book financially. I mean, all I had was a Microsoft Word document and people were willing to put money in to turn it into a book. And I didn't know what it was going to look like. I didn't have any ideas. Of course I had some ideas, but I didn't have any idea what it would actually be. And of course, through their generosity, I was able to hire a world-class photographer, Victor Sizemore, and he knocked it out the park on the photography. And then also along the way, I became involved with Mascot Books. They're a hybrid publisher in Virginia, so they helped me shape the product, or I say the book or the product, whatever you call it, into, an actual tangible dream come true, And so a lot of people helped me make it what it is. And it could not have been done without their help. I had Brett Atlas, was the first copy editor, and Aaron wrote the foreword. There was so many people involved in this. It's more than just me. But I couldn't be more thrilled with how it turned out. Really, really grateful. But to go back to your question, was Campari helpful? Yes, very. They could have shut this down early if they wanted to. You can't just put pictures of, despite what people believe, you can't just put pictures of bottles into a book and sell a book. Those photographs may be yours, but, what the picture is not, And so I had to get permission, to use photographs, whether they were original or from them. And they were very gracious in letting me have that. And I was very grateful for it. So, yes, very cooperative. And I'm just happy it's done, and it's a dream come true.
Let's go back, though, because you talked about Jimmy and Eddie and Bruce, the current three generations at Wild Turkey. But the story really goes back to right around the Civil War on that site up on the old hill overlooking the Kentucky River.
That's right.
Let's get back to the very beginnings of what we know today as Wild Turkey, because it wasn't Wild Turkey back then, was it?
That's right. The story of Wild Turkey is really, you have the story of the distillery, and then you have the story of the brand. And then in between, you have families like the Rippies and Russells, and you have Austin Nichols and Company, which was essentially a grocery wholesaler. And all of these elements kind of, fill in the gaps in the timeline. But it all started with the Rippy family, who came from Ireland and settled in Anderson County, sometime around 1830. And they had a farm, and they had a store, a general store that did very well. After the Civil War, James Rippy Sr. invested in a distillery. A year later, his son, T.B. Rippy, purchased that distillery and bought out the other partners. Basically, that became T.B. Rippy's first distillery. And then T.B. Rippy had a legacy of buying and building and refurbishing distilleries all throughout Anderson County and some outside of Anderson County. He had a very successful career. His brother was a distiller as well, J.P. Rippy, or James P. Rippy, and he purchased property of a distillery that was known as Old Moor, which is the location where Wild Turkey is at now. And that became Old Hickory Springs. When T.B. Rippy became very ill, he sold his distilleries to the Whiskey Trust, or at least the last two of them. He had sold out an awful lot of the other ones before then, and basically left his sons without a distillery. But they pulled their money together and went to their Uncle James and purchased that Old Hickory Springs location, and that became Rippy Brothers. And Rippy Brothers functioned until Prohibition, and they did not secure a medicinal license, so they closed down. Opened back up after Prohibition as Rippy Brothers, and were eventually purchased by the Gould Brothers, and they turned it into Anderson County Distilling Company, and then later operated as JTS Brown. And about that time is where Jimmy comes into play. Jimmy Russell, was hired on to the Anderson County Distilling Company in 1954, and he became master distiller in 1967 of what was then JTS Brown and Sons, same location where Wild Turkey is now.
Wait a second, though. I want to clarify this, because technically it's not. It's where Wild Turkey is now. We're talking where the original distillery was, right on the banks of the river, because that one was torn down several years ago after they moved to the current distillery just up on the hill.
Right. It's the same general property.
Yeah, it's the same neighborhood, but it's not the exact same site.
The original distillery was basically right there across from Rickhouse A, and that's the distillery that had been functioning back when Rippy Brothers owned it pre-Prohibition. Now, it, was torn down, like you said, and they built a new facility in 2011 where the old Rickhouse J used to be. That was essentially the site of that Rickhouse fire. That's where the new facility went. And there's a new bottling facility as well, not too far from it. So, yes, you're right. It's not the exact same distillery, but it is the same geographical location for the most, different side of the road.
I just wanted to clarify that because
yes, definitely.
Folks trace that history back on that little site overlooking the river. Mm-hmm. And technically it's not there anymore, but it's within, say, a driver and a 9-iron shot, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But what's interesting is Rickhouse A, was in existence when J.P. Ripy owned it. So that was probably the main rickhouse there for Old Hickory Springs. What always blows my mind, when I was standing in Rickhouse A last year, I got to thinking about how many decades of master distillers walked the floors and how many decades of barrels, where the Angel's share just went into the bracing and the wood there, that you're just basically smelling history. And so every distiller and every barrel has left its mark on that rickhouse. And so it is true Kentucky history, Rickhouse A. Living history in many ways, because rickhouses are kind of like living things. I mean, they breathe and they age. It's really a unique thing, but not to derail the story. So Jimmy is hired on in 1954 because his wife Jaretta had worked there at Ripy Brothers, and she encouraged him to do that. Now, all along this time, there was a wholesale grocer called Austin Nichols that operated out of Brooklyn, and they were in existence since 1855, technically. And they were the largest grocery wholesaler in the world. And at the turn of the century, when things started becoming more of a 5 and dime operation, they saw the writing on the wall and realized that the old model of the grocery distributor and grocery retailer was changing. And so they diversified and went into wine and spirits, along with continuing on the groceries. And then after Prohibition, they just straight up went all, wine and spirits. Austin Nichols and Company had been sourcing whiskey from Kentucky to make their Austin Nichols bourbon. In the early 40s, around 1940, they had the idea for Wild Turkey Bourbon because of a hunting trip that Thomas McCarthy, who was an executive there, went on, and his buddies really liked the Wild Turkey Bourbon. And that's what they referred to it as because that's how they were familiar with it from the hunting trip. And he had the idea to turn that into a brand. And it became a very successful brand, introduced in 1942, and became popular among actors and presidents. And I mean, the list is pretty significant of the people that love Wild Turkey. But they were sourcing from Kentucky from various distilleries, one of which was Ripy Brothers or Anderson County or JTS Brown, depending on the timeline. And they decided that it was probably best that they go ahead and control what they had, essentially from grain to bottle, and not have to worry about going around shopping around for stocks. So they purchased the distillery, which was JTS Brown at that time in Lawrenceburg, and turned that into the Wild Turkey, or the Austin Nichols Distillery, I guess is the more accurate title. And Jimmy Russell was the master distiller at the time, and he remains the master distiller to this day, and longest tenured master distiller in the world. Of course, Wild Turkey's changed hands a few times. It was sold to Pernod in 1980, sold to Campari in 2009, but the Russells have stayed. Eddie came on board in 1980, and ever since Eddie's been there, it's been Jimmy and Eddie are kind of running things. Jimmy for the longest time, and then Eddie became master distiller in 2015. So it's got quite the story, and my book goes into a lot more detail than I just ran through. But the heart of Wild Turkey is the Russells.
It's interesting, though, that Austin Nichols created the Wild Turkey brand probably 30 years before they bought the distillery. So
That's
a
right.
lot of other Kentucky whiskeys went into Wild Turkey over the years.
Yeah, it was common from what I understand back then. Most of your distilleries were generally just wholesale operations. I mean, you would make the whiskey and you sell the barrels off, and various labels would bottle them, and these labels could exist in cities all over, the U.S., whether it's, Chicago or, New York or wherever. They just slapped a label on it. And, you try to shoot for consistency and this type of thing. But when you're selling to a mass market like that. It's not like we think of it as we think of it today. Sure, whatever you could get at the cheapest price, that's probably what you went for, much like produce or something like that. So really what was in, early Wild Turkey, it could be anything. I did sit down with Eddie and we tasted a late 60s JTS Brown, which for sure is the Wild Turkey distillery that we know of, and a late 60s Austin Nichols 1018 year. And they were very similar to me. They were strikingly similar. Now, to Eddie, he felt like there was something else in the Wild Turkey that made it a little bit different. He suspected like some Old Boone stocks, which Austin Nichols would have owned at that time. But generally, they had similarities more than differences. It's fun to go back and taste these vintage whiskeys and try to figure out who made them. But the interesting thing, that everybody needs to remember is that whiskey then doesn't taste like whiskey now for any producer. So you've really got to be well versed. And of course, Eddie is. Jimmy started him early with, taste a new make and identifying whose new make was whose. And it takes a lot of skill and expertise to do that.
You talk about Jimmy really being the face and the legacy of Wild Turkey in the book. He really is the one who sort of saved the place back in the 70s when nobody was buying bourbon at the time when he decided to create what we know today as Wild Turkey American Honey, right?
That's right. Yeah, the first flavored bourbon, essentially. It was an attempt to try to bring in a new market at a time when people, like you said, weren't drinking bourbon. You had that counterculture generation that didn't want to do what their parents were doing. They didn't want to drink what their grandfather was drinking or what their father was drinking. They wanted to have their own identity, and so they were moving to lighter spirits like vodka and gin. The whiskey world tried to adjust for this, and they did things like light whiskey. You can look at the ads from like the early 70s and stuff, and these ads are like the lightest whiskey ever made, or smooth and easy. Everything's all about the opposite of bold and flavorful. And another thing was the decanters. The distilleries tried to market these collectibles as just a way to get rid of some of these barrels and get them out there as something that maybe people would buy as a gift, or maybe someone that doesn't even drink bourbon might buy it. Of course, these proved to be, popular for a very short period of time, and then that whole thing kind of collapsed. It's kind of like the Beanie Babies of whiskey or something. But anyway, Jimmy, he innovated. He came up with the American Honey, or at that time it was Wild Turkey Liqueur was the name of it at the time. And it was a blend of real honey and bourbon, essentially. And it was to try to bring in a new audience, whether it was, a younger audience or the counterculture audience, or maybe bring in more of a female demographic. It was an attempt. And hey, it's still around. So it's a popular liqueur. And again, that was the first bourbon-based liqueur that we can find.
I just think it's funny that the bourbon purist that is Jimmy Russell was the guy who came up with the first flavored bourbon.
Yeah, he did. You're right. And Jimmy is very much about as bourbon purist as they get. But desperate times call for desperate measures. And he had a hit on his hands. Like I said, it's still around. It's called American Honey now, but it's pretty much the same thing. The proof's changed a little bit, and it's probably made a little bit differently than what they're originally doing, but it's a hit. You had mentioned about Jimmy saving the place. I mean, he didn't just save Wild Turkey. Jimmy was one of several that saved bourbon. And it was because of his stubbornness and his, pride that he did not bend to, liqueur was like a very small thing that he did to try to bring in somebody else. But other than that, he didn't go changing the whiskey much at all. The bourbon stayed on 101 8 years or 12 years, and he put it out there, kept making it, whether it was profitable or not. But to me, the thing where Jimmy really shines the most is he's the ultimate brand ambassador. I mean, you can sit, and you've done it before, you sit down and you talk with Jimmy Russell, you could talk to Jimmy all day and it would never get old. It's like he has a way to converse and draw you into how passionate he is about, maybe it's whiskey, or maybe it's just, him wanting to hear about your life or where you're from. And it's the ultimate brand ambassadorism. I guess you could say it's like he just connects with people. And if you can do that, people will find interest in your product, even if it's indirectly. You're kind of saying, I'm similar to you, we're more like each other than you think. And they relate to you, and then they explore what you do, which is, in Jimmy's case, make whiskey. And he wasn't the only one. Booker traveled around. I mean, these guys hit the road, and they were the road warriors, and they basically talked America one location at a time back into bourbon again.
I often wonder what it's going to be like for us years from now when we don't have Jimmy around anymore, because Eddie's great. Bruce is going to be a rock star one of these days, but they still live in Jimmy's shadow and probably always will.
Well, I try not to think about it. I know what you're saying. And it's one of those things where you have to kind of accept that, there's that reality there. But I think that Jimmy's legacy with Wild Turkey is so ingrained and so cemented in the brand now. Jimmy's going to live on forever. I mean, there will always be that connection with Jimmy and Wild Turkey. Just look at, I think that Beam does a good job with this. I mean, Booker, I was just talking about this last night. I did a little live stream for my birthday, and I was looking at the Booker's 30th box, and it's made from rickhouse wood, and there's engraved on the front, it said, this is made from reclaimed wood from Jim Beam rickhouses. Booker once walked these floors, and it just has this, you connect, and they've done such a good job of maintaining that. It's like you have to remind yourself that Booker's not here, because it's almost like he's immortal. And the same thing's going to happen with Wild Turkey. Jimmy's his legacy is so intertwined with that brand. Jimmy's going to live forever in our hearts and mind. I mean, that I don't even think about it. I just think that's how it's going to be. As for the future, Eddie has done a jam up job, and the proof is in the pudding, because the whiskeys that we taste and enjoy now are largely the work of Eddie. Of course, you've got Jimmy's approval, but Eddie's doing the heavy lifting. Eddie's the one making these Master's Keep products, making Russell Reserve Single Barrel, making the 101 that everybody loves. And people have to give credit to Eddie Russell, because he has almost single-handedly taken this brand to the next level just in the last, 10, years or so. And there's a significant credit due there. Him and Jimmy aren't the same personality. They're just two totally different personalities. But Eddie knows how to make good whiskey. He knows how to make damn fine whiskey. And like I said, the proof is in the pudding. Go out and buy a bottle of Russell's Reserve Single Barrel, and you'll see how good of a job Eddie Russell does. As for Bruce, he's kind of a lot like Jimmy, but he's also a lot like Eddie. He's kind of like the best of both worlds. And he's also a lot like Doretta. So you have this personality that is going to really draw people to him. I really believe that. At the same time, he has an appreciation for whiskeys that maybe even Eddie and Jimmy aren't so into. Bruce, is willing to go and experiment and find things in other whiskeys that, Jimmy definitely wouldn't give the time of day. Jimmy doesn't even like rye. So you've got Bruce, that's his favorite. But, I've heard Bruce talk about Scotch and other things. And I think that, the future for Wild Turkey looks bright. I think you'll always have that Jimmy legacy, and the bourbon will always show that. But who knows what else is down the road? I mean, they could expand their rye presence even more so than now if they really wanted to. And that wouldn't touch Jimmy's legacy at all, because Jimmy's not a big rye person. So they could have different rye mash bills. You could go with different finishes. There's all kinds of things they can do. The sky's the limit for Wild Turkey. And I think they've got the right people in the driver's seat right now to make that happen.
As we're recording this interview, it's August 1st, and the pandemic is still with us, and it's been a month since they reopened the visitor center at Wild Turkey, where Jimmy has been known to hang out regularly and has not been able to. They banned him from the place. They blocked off his parking lot. They took the battery out of his scooter that he uses to get around the place.
They've locked him down.
They've locked him down and pretty much put a moat of Purell around him to keep him healthy. And this has got to be killing him, to be stuck at home and not be able to go around to the distillery.
It's got to be. I hope it brought him a little bit of pleasure. I sent him an early workup of my book, what they call an ARC, which is an advanced reader copy. And then I sent him the real book later. And I hope maybe that brought him a little. Although knowing Jimmy, he'd probably flip through and be like, this ain't right. But no, in all fairness, I think he probably enjoyed it. Besides, a lot of it came straight from Jimmy. But yeah, they've had to lock him down. And the visitor center is open. It's just limited in how many they can see and what days of the week and that type of thing. But it's not the same without Jimmy. I will admit that. You know, you've been there, you've seen the lines. He's like a rock star, you know, and it's just, he'll be there sitting there, and all of a sudden the line will just form, and people, you know, they love Jimmy Russell, and he talks to every single one of them. You know, it's like, it reminds me of Santa Claus. You know, it's like these kids waiting in line to see, and that's how it very much feels. The very first time I met Jimmy, it wasn't at Lawrenceburg, it was in Columbia, South Carolina. And it was like, I felt like a kid going to see Santa Claus. I mean, that was the best way to describe it. And, you know, it very much ended up just like that. You know, you get to sit there and talk to him, and it's cool. And you're right. He's locked down right now, and he's probably killing him. It's for the best. Mm-hmm. But it's a crazy world out there right now. So let's protect Jimmy Russell.
Thanks to David Jennings for spending some time with us on WhiskyCast In-Depth this week. There's a link to his website for his new book, American Spirit, Wild Turkey Bourbon From Ripy to Russell, in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. I'd recommend it for any Wild Turkey fan, and for the record, I paid full price for my copy. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the Angel's Envy 10th Anniversary Japanese Mizunara Cask Finish Bourbon that we talked about during the news. It's bottled at 48.9% ABV. The nose has a nice combination of oak and pine needles, along with wet straw, soft spices, and hints of incense, honey, and vanilla. The taste has good spices along with a touch of garden herbs, dried fruits, and pine needles for an excellent complexity and balance. The spices take over a bit on the finish and fade away gently. I'm scoring the Angel's Envy Japanese Mizunara Cask Finish Bourbon a 94. And speaking of Japan, Nikka recently started exporting its Nikka Days blended whiskey to the U.S. It's a blend of Nikka's lightly peated malts with its grain whiskey and bottled at 40% ABV. The nose is crisp and clean with a hint of grilled pineapple and touches of butterscotch candies, honey, and vanilla. The taste is light, tart, and citrusy with pineapple and hints of grapefruit and mango, complemented by honey, butterscotch, and a hint of smoke that develops slowly. The finish is medium length with that gentle smokiness and a nice fruity character. I'm scoring the Nikka Days Japanese Blended Whiskey a 90. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They'll be releasing the next batch of Penny's Proof later this year. It's a preview of Sagamore Spirit whiskey distilled on site in Baltimore, and last year's first release of samples sold out in hours. The only way to find out when and how to get your hands on this year's batch is to join Sagamore Spirit's Whiskey Thieves Club. Sign up today at sagamorespirit.com. I recently received a sample of the latest batch of Barrel's Dovetail, which won a Chairman's Trophy at the recent Ultimate Spirits Challenge. It's a blend of 11-year-old whiskey from Tennessee and 10-year-old Indiana whiskey, finished in a combination of rum, port, and Cabernet wine barrels, and this batch is bottled at 62.17% ABV. The nose is very smooth, with notes of peaches, apples, and red grapes, along with honey, oak, and a touch of vanilla. The taste has a good balance of spices and fruity character, with black pepper, cinnamon, apples, peach nectar, and hints of honey and vanilla. The finish is long and smooth, with a good balance of spices and fruitiness that fades away gently. I'm scoring this batch of Barrel Dovetail a 94. And finally, let's look at the latest release from House Spirits in Portland, Oregon. Its annual Westward Whiskey release of an American single malt whiskey finished in Oregon Pinot Noir wine casks. It's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose is fruity and well-balanced with hints of red grapes and apricots, along with a touch of mint leaves, honey, and caramel candy. The taste is fruity and tart, with apricots, plums, hints of figs and raisins, subtle spices, honey, and a touch of mint. The finish is long and fruity with a slightly astringent character, and I'm scoring Westward's 2020 Oregon Pinot Noir finish a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,900 different whiskeys from around the world. You can check it out at whiskycast.com. It's time to announce our latest Whiskey Club of the Month. Each month we pick a whiskey club somewhere in the world, and they'll receive 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at their club tastings. This month we're going all the way to New Zealand to pick our Club of the Month. Nick Keane emailed us to nominate the Devonport Dram Drinkers of Auckland. And here's what he wrote. We're a small and boisterous club with just over a dozen members. No website set up at the moment. Membership is just by word of mouth. We made the mistake of getting a bunch of Copita glasses when the club started, but our rowdy nature and extended meetings mean that breakages are common. The Pete heads versus the sherry heads conversations can get pretty animated by the end of the night. Some sturdy Glencairns would help replenish the stock. Nick, I'm glad we can help you with that. We'll be sending you 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses for your meetings. They're pretty sturdy, but please take care of them, and thanks for nominating your club. If you'd like to nominate your whiskey club for consideration next month, all you have to do is use the comment form at whiskycast.com or email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Just tell us a bit about your club, and if you have a website or a social media presence for your club, we'll be glad to add a link on the Whiskey Clubs page at whiskycast.com so other whiskey lovers can find you. Once again, congratulations to the Devonport Dram Drinkers of Auckland, New Zealand, our Whiskey Club of the Month, and thanks to Glencairn Crystal for helping us support whiskey clubs around the world. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Lots of people watch our webcasts, including a few who have appeared as guests before. During our Happy Hour webcast on Friday night, we were discussing issues of race and inclusion in the whiskey industry when longtime whiskey writer Dominic Roscrow posted this question in our Facebook chat room. Given what's happened with the Washington NFL team that recently dropped its offensive team nickname, are you all happy with the name Buffalo Trace? Well, Buffalo Trace does not have a link to Native Americans, though. It's the term that refers to the old trails created by migrating buffalo. And Tom Kimmerer, who will be on our webcast this Wednesday, chimed in with this. Every major road in central Kentucky was originally a buffalo trace, a trail created by American bison. There are still many old buffalo traces. It has nothing to do with race or even with people. The Bluegrass region, not the state, had the largest population of bison east of the Mississippi, so Buffalo Trace as a distillery name is perfectly honorable. For the record, Dominic was perfectly fine with that answer, and it's good to get that cleared up. Last time around, Sean Josephs mentioned deductive tasting during our WhiskyCast In-Depth interview, and at Whiskey Guild in West Virginia tweeted this question. Listening to the WhiskyCast episode this week, deductive tasting is discussed. Mark, do you have a recommended deductive tasting grid for whiskey? I see several online options. Well, I've never used one, so it would be hard for me to recommend the concept. Keep in mind that Sean trained as a wine sommelier before he started working with whiskies. And there are so many different varieties of wine that sommeliers have to taste blind as part of their evaluations. That's where a deductive tasting grid can come in handy to help a sommelier work out the differences between, say, a Pinot Grigio and a Chardonnay. Davin DeCurgamo also responded to the tweet. We used these when I did my sommelier training. They were the result of long, careful research and vetting. What I have seen for whiskey seems to be based on some opinions and unsubstantiated assumptions. So, if you have a question, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. If you visit a bourbon distillery or talk with a distiller, you're liable to hear references to No. 2 yellow dent corn as their preferred choice for making bourbon. But ask a farmer if they're growing No. 2 yellow dent corn in their fields, and they're probably likely to look at you as though you have two heads. To be fair, I have referred to No. 2 yellow dent corn before here on WhiskyCast, but when farmers are placing their seed orders over the winter for the next planting season, they don't order No. 2 yellow dent corn. That's because it is not a specific type of corn, but the way harvested corn is rated. Trek Murray works with both distillers and farmers at Beck's Hybrids. It's one of the largest suppliers of seed corn in the U.S. He's based in Atlanta, Indiana, and explained the grading system to me.
As a farmer brings in his load of corn to the buyer, they will take a sample of that corn. At that point in time, they do what they call a grade on it. The grading consists of pulling out foreign material, pulling out any brokens or cracked kernels out of that. They also take a density on it by test weight. And based on the criteria, how much each one of those in their each how much foreign material, how much brokens and cracks in there, any diseases in there, and the density determines on which grade it goes into. So that's really how that happens. So for test weight is, I think, number one, I think it's got to be a 58-pound test weight corn. And then it's got to have only so much broken or cracks in it and only have so much foreign material into it. So based on that, it'll go into a certain grade, and it's sold at different rates across the world based on those grades.
So it's really not a style of corn, it's a grade for the existing corn that you have.
Correct. Now, certain corns will more easily make a number 1 versus a number 2 or even number 3. I think they even have a number 4 yellow corn, to be truthful.
But just using one of those specific seeds doesn't guarantee that the final corn will be graded number 1 or even number 2. If the weather doesn't cooperate and farmers can't get their crop into the ground by mid-April in the Midwest, along with good rainfall in the weeks after planting, they run the risk of hot, dry weather stunting the growth during July and August. And a field that produced a great crop of number 1 or number 2 yellow dent corn last year might produce a lower grade this year. By the way, number 2 is the minimum most distilleries will accept. They prefer number 1 corn. And as for that 58-pound density Trek Murray mentioned, well, that's 58 pounds per bushel. And since bushels do not convert well to the metric system, it's easier to convert the pounds. It's about 26.3 kilograms per bushel. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find details on our live webcasts every Wednesday and Friday, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, our whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. You can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments at whiskycast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, wear your masks, and please stay safe.